In the last module, we got into two core components of narcissism, shame, and grandiosity. We also looked at how some clients develop grandiosity as a way to protect themselves from chronic shame. And in this module, we'll look at how a client's experience of trauma might enter in.
Obviously, I think of grandiosity as part of the picture of someone with narcissistic personality disorder. But I also think about narcissism and grandiosity in the context of trauma, and how the extremes of traumatic experience tend more often to result in profound and painful shame. Shame that tortures our clients for years and decades. And so when I encounter grandiosity, I assume that the other side of it is shame, and that the grandiosity arose as a way to counter the shame.
Now, as I know you know, and as Dr. Janina Fisher just mentioned, shame can be a very common after effect of trauma and early attachment disturbances. It's also why we might sometimes see narcissism and grandiosity arise out of these experiences. But there are other factors in a client's childhood that can also contribute. That's what we'll get into in this module as we dive deeper into the connections between attachment, trauma, and narcissism. First, we'll take a look at 3 specific ways that narcissism can take root in childhood. You'll also get a general framework of how you might approach narcissism that stems from trauma or attachment disturbances. So first, let's look at a few types of experiences in childhood that may contribute to narcissism.
And a lot of times the root is going to be some sort of rupture or ruptures in attachment, oftentimes first occurring in childhood. And this might be large T DSM-5 PTSD criteria type trauma, or it might be something a little bit more subtle. It might be something like neglect, or just that every single time they expressed an emotion, their parent got mad at them. Okay, the caretaker didn't want to hear it. It was considered weak. It might also be the case that growing up, maybe it was an abusive environment, but it's not uncommon to hear that for some of these clients, they themselves were never hit. They might say, well, it was my brother who was hit, or it was my sister who was abused. But what they might have learned from those experiences is that making a mistake, not being perfect, resulted in abuse, resulted in horrible things happening. So the takeaway message is, I have to be the best. I have to win. I have to be right all the time. And this is the only way for me to stay safe. Now, of course, this is not happening consciously usually, but that might be the lesson learned. But a lot of times the origins was that severing of the connection with other human beings.
Dr. Jennifer Sweeten just highlighted how childhood trauma, abuse, or neglect can give rise to narcissism. And I want to emphasize one point of Jennifer's in particular, that a client doesn't always have to be in the direct recipient of that abuse. Sometimes the exposure alone is enough for narcissistic tendencies to take root. So let's look at another way narcissism might develop out of childhood experiences.
One very obvious set of circumstances is having a narcissistic parent, especially a narcissistic parent who has narcissistic expectations of the child. A grandiose parent or a very hostile, controlling parent breeds a kind of rebelliousness in the child. So again, I think in part, so I think of it as a protector part. So that as the parent is putting the child down, that grandiose part is internally saying, no, you're the idiot, not me.
So when a caregiver imparts unrealistic or perfectionistic expectations to a child, that can be another way for narcissism to lay down roots. And as you'll hear in Module 7, there can also be an intergenerational transmission of narcissism. Now, just a few moments ago, we talked about how narcissism can arise from deep feelings of shame that stem from childhood events. But according to Dr. Peter Levine, narcissism can also develop in environments where there's a lack of shame. Again, and just like we talked about in the last module, clients who are narcissistic will often inflate with grandiosity or deflate with shame. The thing is, a healthy amount of inflation and deflation can be key to a child's development, especially as they begin exploring the world.
And around 18 months to a couple of years, there's a profound change in the developing toddler's needs. And that's when they begin for the first time to, instead of creeping and crawling, they start to stand. And then they start to locomote. And the whole world is completely different. I call it the world be my oyster. They're into absolutely everything. And this is being mediated, I believe, by the emergence of the dopamine system. So it's really all about exploration. It's all about excitement. And kids, of that age can get into a lot of trouble. I mean, I have a picture I use in teaching of this kid who's at the top of a big hill going into a lake, and he's on his skateboard, and he's just getting ready to go. And you got to stop him. You got to say, stop. And this is like a break. It's a vagal break. You have to be able to stop the child and stop the child quickly before they can do damage to themselves and to others. Because really, kids, if they don't get those boundaries, if they're not set, they will just continue to go into an inflation mode. Because again, remember, when you get up and you see the world in this new way, that's about inflation. That's really, really totally about inflation. But then it has to be stopped. It has to have limits set to it. So then when the parent or the caregiver says, no, that's the deflation. The inflation is the world is my oyster. The deflation is no. Now, that often gets handled very poorly. I think in instances where parents they want to be the child's best friend. The parents, they're not able to say no, and to say no, and I love you. It's not what you can't do this. This is not okay. You're going to hurt somebody.
Now, I want to dive just a little deeper into this idea that narcissism can develop in environments that lack a healthy amount of shame. To give you a clearer picture, there's some research I'd like you to hear about.
So the state of New Hampshire, where I lived, and other states as well, passed legislation that said that schools were mandated to have bullying training, the staff and that kind of stuff. And so they called me, because here I am in Concord, New Hampshire. Several schools called me and said, would you be willing to do some bullying training? Well, I thought, okay, well, I haven't really done bullying training, but I'll figure it out. And so I started doing research and making sure that I was talking about this accurately. The thing that was interesting to me is that not all bullies are the same. And when we look at this idea of narcissism and grandiosity as a thin shell for insecurity, there are several different types of bullies. There is one group of bullies that is absolutely the wounded kid. right? So hurt people, right? We hear that all the time. And there is a group of bullies where when we look at their history, when we look at what they're living in with their own family, they could be potentially being abused. There's neglect. These are kids that are really, really struggling emotionally and socially. There's another group of bullies that bully in a group because they are outcasts. And so the way that they feel powerful is they band together, sort of like the gang mentality, and then they are stronger in numbers. And these are also kids that feel a lack of connection and a lack of, attachment to their family and that kind of stuff. But the third group of bullies was the most interesting to me, because the trope of the bully with a heart of gold doesn't always play out. There is a group of bullies that when we study them, when we look at them, they are actually incredibly emotionally and physically strong. Doesn't mean emotionally healthy, but they are emotionally strong and they are physically strong. They are predators. These bullies consistently go after the kids that are less than. So these bullies go after kids that have some sort of disability, the kids that wear glasses, the kids that are weaker. These are not kids that when we look at them and we scratch the surface that we find a lot of insecurity in there. We find more bullying. We find entitlement. We find kids that were raised in environments in which they were told over and over again that they could get whatever they want, they could have whatever they want, and that they were better than everybody else. And I think that we need to recognize that. They are not suffering. They enjoy the position of being on top. They're going to exert that power, and they believe that they deserve to exert that power. So I think we really need to make sure that we're aware of that when we're dealing with kids that are being bullied or kids that are dealing with narcissists. There are narcissistic parents that fall into that category. We just have to make sure that we don't continue this trope that everybody who's grandiose is wounded inside, because that's not the truth. Yeah, not the truth.
The research that Lynn Lyons just shared helps to demonstrate how narcissism can take root in environments where the idea of superiority is not only accepted, but reinforced. Now that you've gotten a sense of how attachment disturbances and childhood trauma can impact narcissism, how might you begin to address that link?
Now, if indeed narcissism is compensatory to injuries, traumas, and feelings of inadequacy, we're probably not going to be able to relinquish the narcissism unless we can in some way integrate and heal those past traumas. So helping a person to remember all of the self-esteem crashes, the rejections, the feelings of inferiority, and see if they're able to open to those feelings now and view them through adult eyes, view them perhaps through wise and compassionate eyes, and then care for their vulnerable part, the inner child, if you will, the exile, the part of themselves that was so hurt in these situations.
So one approach is to help clients revisit their wounded child as a compassionate adult. Now that's not always so simple, because as we've seen throughout this course so far, a client's grandiosity is often there to protect their most ashamed, vulnerable parts. So how might you begin to help a client access those parts?
One approach is to simply begin by being friendly, listening, and tolerating the narcissistic presentation. This is not easy to do as a therapist, I find, to have somebody basically boast and tell us how wonderful they are. But sometimes I think we need to do some of that in order to gain their trust to a bit. There is the other approach, which is to confront it early on. My friend Terry Real is very good at doing this, particularly around toxically masculine, narcissistic guys, where after a very brief period of time, he says, cut the crap. We know what you're doing here, and don't do it. But you need a certain kind of self-confidence to pull that off that I don't think I often do, that I often have. So once we've established some kind of a rapport, either through cut the crap or by listening for a while to the boasting, if we're going to get to the vulnerability underneath, we need some way to identify the pain of the narcissism. It has so many different possible costs. Very often a person has screwed up their relationships in some way because of the narcissism, and we can talk to them about the pain of the relationship not having worked out. Very often there's the stress to constantly perform, and we can talk to them about the pain of that stress. There's the anxiety of warding off possible collapses, and we can talk about the pain of that anxiety, or the periodic depression when crashes do occur and their narrative has been challenged. Since most of us aren't proud of our narcissism, it requires a certain kind of normalizing, I think, to get people to relax into talking about how painful this is. And I tend to talk in general how everybody's concerned with how they're seen by others. Everybody is concerned with self-evaluation. Everybody wants to feel good about themselves. And most everybody has moments of winning and losing. And we have moments where we're not always on top, and how difficult these are. And sharing that, including sharing my own, is often a way to universalize it sufficiently so the person might be able to relax and admit it to themselves. And then from this, we come to, of course, this is a natural result of what you've been through. Of course, you would want to present yourself positively, given the pain that you have experienced. And the final goal, as I see it, of working with narcissism is to really be able to embrace ordinary, common humanity, to help the person to see that, yes, they have many strengths, they may have some weaknesses as well, but in many ways, this is besides the point of living a life. That living a life actually, if we want to really have peace, well-being, connection, and flourish, it's going to be about safe social connection, and it's going to be about engaging this organism, this who we are, in doing what it does, being productive in whatever way we can be productive, but not doing it in order to cling to the highs, not doing it in order to cling to the boosts of victories and thinking, oh, hey, look at me, I'm better than others, but to do it for the joy of engagement and the joy of connecting to others as they engage. So I'll very often look for glimmers of this in the person's life where they've had tastes of it, and help them to see that, oh yeah, there is an alternate pathway. There is a way to have much more reliable well-being that's actually much more fulfilling if they can relinquish the clinging to the narcissistic approach. It's hard to sell this sometimes because our culture marinates in the idea that winning, being on top, getting the A, whatever metric it is the pathway to well-being. And it is briefly. But the thing is, it's only so briefly, because it doesn't take long before we crash again, and then we're scrambling to try to reconstitute our position.
You might break down Ron's approach into 4 steps. The first step involves establishing a level of trust with the client. This can be done either by listening to a client's grandiosity for a time or by naming it directly. The second step is helping the client connect with the costs and the pain associated with the narcissism. The third step is to normalize your client's narcissism as a natural response to their past wounds. And finally, the fourth step is about helping clients embrace the idea that having safe, rewarding connection often feels better than being superior to others. So by now, we've looked at 3 different ways that narcissism can take root in response to childhood experiences. And as you've gotten a general framework for how you might work with narcissism rooted in attachment disturbances and trauma. So in the next module, I want to take you through 3 cases that help demonstrate exactly how these ideas might play out in your clinical work. I'll see you over in Module 4.